instead of Karen, if that's all right, John. And if I could grab your name and title for the recording, please.
Yeah, I'm John Bent, Detective Chief Inspector and one of the senior investigating officers in the Forces Homicide Team.
Fantastic. So could you sort of start by just talking us through this case, John?
Yeah, the Scott Pritchard murder goes back 14 years to 2004. Sadly, one of a handful of undetected murders that the force has had. It was a huge inquiry back in the day, over 300 police officers involved over the course of the inquiry, some 1,600 statements taken, 4,000 documents, a significant investigation which sadly remained undetected. It was a brutal, savage murder of a 19-year-old lad at his back gate. The case was investigated thoroughly, but unfortunately it kind of was not closed, because we never close those inquiries, and we review them every year or two afterwards, particularly for forensic evidence, with techniques becoming more sophisticated as time goes by. But on the 31st of July this year, a woman by the name of Karen Tunmore turned up here at Middle Engine Lane and confessed to that murder.
And how often does that kind of thing happen?
Extremely rare, not unheard of nationally, but certainly in my 23 years of policing, I don't know of another case where this has happened. She would recount that she's lived with the horrific murder that she committed over many years and found it difficult to live with any longer, and decided she needed to get it off her chest.
And Scott himself, on the night of the attack, he had a cast, or his leg was in plaster, is that right?
Yeah, he had a cast on his right leg as he'd broken his right foot some time earlier. And again, all of that detail, it's interesting that Tunmore never figured in the original inquiry. She's pretty parochial to Killingworth and North Tyneside, didn't know Sunderland, wasn't known by anybody, didn't figure in the original inquiry. It looks like her connection with Scott Pritchard was through not an accomplice, but somebody that she was with on the evening, and who took her through to see Scott. And she describes how he had the cast on his leg, during the meeting that she had with him, and the ultimate kind of assault that took place afterwards.
And do you think that made him an easier target and more likely to be preyed on, that kind of thing?
Potentially, yeah. He certainly wasn't as mobile, but from her account and from what we know of the the injuries he sustained and how he was found, potentially he didn't know what was about to happen to him. She says it was financially motivated, and when he couldn't pay a debt, she saw red. She'd had a baseball bat with her. She says she was violent when she'd been drinking at that time, and says in her own words that she saw red and laid into him with the baseball bat 3 or 4 times, which is entirely consistent with the injuries Scott received, and the level of detail that she knew was chillingly accurate to detail that we never released at the time of the inquiry.
I know you've kind of touched on it, but what was the size of this inquiry? What kind of resources, and how rare is that kind of stuff?
I mean, a whodunit murder, very much, which are significant. As I say, over 300 police officers involved over a long period of time. Fortunately, we don't have, over the years, too many crimes that aren't detected, but perhaps this one was fairly unique because there was no direct link between the victim and the offender, it would appear, which is why she never figured in the original inquiry. There were arrests made, but nobody was ever brought to justice. In some respects, for the family now, at least there is some form of justice, that the person eventually has been brought to justice for the offence.
And there are probably some people listening to this, watching this, who will be surprised to hear that it was someone so unrelated to the victim. In your 23 years of policing, how often have you seen that?
I mean, that can happen. That wouldn't be unusual. What she would say is the person she travelled to the scene with, who we are very interested in tracing, which we haven't done, she hasn't named, other than it was a person called Steve, or Stee, as a kind of nickname, who was a part of the Hendon Mad Dogs crew at the time, who would have been known to Scott. That was very parochial to the Hendon area. That person knew Scott. He was owed money by Scott, and she was owed money by this person. So there was a link, but that link would have never been known to the inquiry team. But we are still very keen to trace Steve, or Stee, and he's clearly been there at the time, and he also would have lived with this over the last 14 years.
And when Karen Tunmore came forward, did she show remorse? What kind of attitude did she have at the time?
Yeah, clearly and visibly upset. It's quite a a kind of shock, quite unusual for us to deal with something like that, but she had all the hallmarks of somebody that was living with guilt and was distressed by the kind of disclosure that she was making. The interviewing officers who interviewed her are very experienced, have done this for many years and were convinced of her guilt, seemed remorseful, genuine, and contrite for her actions, and wanted to get it off her chest.
And after so long, well, with this inquiry, but with other inquiries as well, what kind of challenges do you guys face with that time passing?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge for us is clearly kind of a conviction based on a confession alone. It is tenuous. So it's no different in some respects to having a case where we didn't have somebody confessing. We need to corroborate or rule out that person as being responsible, which has been quite challenging given quite a tight period of time. 1st of October, she'd be sentenced. She turned up on the 31st of July. It's a huge amount of work. None of the inquiry team worked 14 years ago on this job, so kind of it's going through all the original case papers and all the original evidence, and then everything to do with Tunmore's account in a relatively short period of time, because she did plead guilty on her first appearance at court, and the judge indicated that he would sentence her on the 1st of October. So a lot of work to do to corroborate or negate the account that she'd given.
And also over time, I imagine you stay quite close to Scott's family. What's it been like for them?
You can't imagine what Scott's family have probably been through over the last 14 years. His father's been particularly ill and suffered a significant heart attack yesterday, so kind of the stress and trauma that they've endured over many years must have been very, very difficult. Very difficult for Mum. Catastrophic loss of her son, but from a police perspective, we can only be thankful to the family for their empathy, their support, and their patience with the police over many years. And if there's one solace, that perhaps they've got some form of justice now.
I was going to say, after 15 years, do you think Monday will be a moment for yourself and for the family?
Yeah, certainly for the family. This is a rather unusual case in terms of it's somebody who's walked in off the streets and confessed to it. From the police's perspective, great that an offence has been brought to justice, but much more important for the family to have some feeling of the person that's remained at large for 14 years, responsible for taking their son away from them, is finally behind bars.
That's great. Is there anything else you'd like to add, John?
No.
That's lovely. Thank you.